Ottawa is looking into the possibility of revoking the citizenship of a man accused of planning a terror attack in Toronto. 62-year-old Ahmed Fouad Mustafa LDD and his son, 26-year-old Mustafa LDD, were arrested on July 29th. They face multiple charges, including conspiracy to commit murder for the benefit or at the direction of a terrorist group. Immigration Minister Marc Miller says he is looking into how two terror suspects with ties to ISIS got into Canada in the first place and how one even received Canadian citizenship.
I'm as disgusted as any Canadian, but I have a responsibility to get to the bottom of it, and I will. I'm also going to take the next step, which is to start the preliminary work with the evidence at hand to look at whether the individual in question's citizenship should be revoked.
The CBC's Catharine Tunney is following this story, and she joins me now. Hey, Kat.
Hello.
So what exactly is the minister promising to do here?
Yeah, so there's two things that he talked about today. So one is kind of this promise to figure out what the hell happened here and who knew what when it came to, Ahmed LDD's alleged ties to ISIS and then the timeline of events that ultimately got him to Canadian citizenship. And that's something that reporters have been kind of after and looking, asking questions for about 2 weeks now. And we've also heard the Prime Minister and the Public Safety Minister also promise, there's a timeline and we'll release what we can when we can. So we'll be watching that, of course. But probably the newer thing today was this promise, or at least the minister saying that he's looking into, work is underway, he says, to look at whether the father's citizenship should and can be revoked.
Yeah, that's something that doesn't happen here very often. What can you tell us about how that would work if they did actually try to pursue revocation?
Yeah, I mean, this is not a light switch. It's not, oh, you have citizenship, oh, we've decided you don't. There is a process. And before we even dive into that, let's remember that there's also a court case going on. There's a whole other process, and we're at the very beginning of that. So it's probably a long, long road before a trial and then ultimately a verdict. But when it comes to citizenship, as you said, revoking is a controversial move, and it's one that has seen the Liberal Party go against the Conservative Party. We remember under Stephen Harper, of course. So now under, I want to say newish laws, but 2017, I guess, is further back than I can remember. Due to the newish law, someone's citizenship can be revoked if ultimately they misrepresented themselves, fraud, lied, basically, as part of that process. And it's on the Immigration Department to kind of look into that, to investigate, and then ultimately it's the minister who would bring what's just called an action, to the federal court. But since about 2018, it's the federal court that ultimately decides and is the decision maker on citizenship cases, unless the person specifically asks for the minister to be the decision maker. So as you kind of saw in that clip there from Miller, he's using words like preliminary and evidence. So it very much sounds like it's at the very beginning of that stage, the investigative stage. So definitely a few more threads to pull on here, and threads that I'm sure the parliamentary committee that has agreed to study this issue will take on later this month.
Right, so it's something that's not necessarily imminent, but we'll be watching for it. Thank you so much, CBC's Catharine Tunney. Thanks for bringing us that story tonight. The Immigration Minister says he's disgusted that a suspected terrorist has Canadian citizenship.
Who knew what, when, and how? I hope to be able to provide answers in a relatively short timeline about what happened. I'm as disgusted as any Canadian, but I have a responsibility to get to the bottom of it, and I will.
Miller is talking about Ahmed Fouad Mustafa LDD, a Canadian man accused of working with ISIS abroad back in 2015, and now LDD and his son Mustafa have been arrested on conspiracy charges. They were allegedly working for a terrorist group here in this country, and there are now questions about whether immigration officials missed LDD's past activities and if his citizenship should be revoked. It's time to bring in the Power Panel. Amanda Alvaro is a former Liberal Party communications strategist. Here with me in studio, Tim Powers is a former strategist for Conservative parties, and Jordan Likeness is a former NDP strategist. Welcome to the show, guys. How's it going?
Good. How are you?
Good.
Nice to see you all. Amanda, I'll start with you on this one. What do you make of this case? It seems like there are some serious questions to be asked about whether an alleged terrorist who worked for ISIS should have been in this country and been granted citizenship. Do you think that the government might have missed something? And should there be really maybe a better vetting process for newcomers?
Well, I think those are all the questions that are obviously being asked. And, Minister Miller did not mince words today. He usually doesn't. He said he was, as disgusted as any Canadian at the prospect of somebody who would have misrepresented themselves go on to, allegedly look at creating and committing an act of terrorism in the country. So he's taken the actions which he can take right now, which is if the ministry suspects that somebody has misrepresented themselves, they can start an investigation, they can collect evidence, and they can ultimately start an action with a federal court. And it's the federal court who will make that decision ultimately. But I think that he was pretty clear in his words today. And I think that those are words that are shared by a lot of Canadians who are looking in at what we know. And we only know what we know, but looking in at what we know and saying, how disgusting it would be for somebody to come here to claim Canadian citizenship and to commit an act or to propose to commit an act of any nature that would be considered terroristic.
Yeah, Tim, as Amanda points out, it's just allegations at this point, at least as it relates to the Toronto incident, the alleged Toronto incident with his son. But Marc Miller already floating this idea of revoking his citizenship. Do you think that that's an appropriate course of action? Is that something the government should pursue? And would it be a bit tricky for this government? Because obviously, as you probably remember, Justin Trudeau famously said, a Canadian is a Canadian is a Canadian. Is there an exception in this case, do you think?
Well, let me say a few things, JP, before I answer your question specifically, because that's what we like to do on this program. I think I agree with Amanda. Marc Miller's language was powerful and thoughtful. The challenge maybe for Minister Miller, who is a credible minister, I think we would all agree with that, is that perhaps this should have been said a week ago. I think the government has been playing catch up on this particular story. Both the NDP and the Conservatives have been out front of it. And there may be totally legitimate reasons as to why, but around the politics of it, again, it looks like the government is playing catch up. And there may be a whole plethora of appropriate reasons, again, when the evidence is presented to revoke the citizenship. But I think the Liberals are going to be scored on whether they do or they don't. I think whatever the legal rationale is, the opinion rationale is going to be the citizenship should be revoked. So, the Liberals are struggling with this issue. The other thing I would add, and you've seen my colleague David Coletto talk about this, immigration issues are boiling up again, and they're driving votes. And while I take Minister Miller at his word, and I view him as a credible communicator and a credible official, the government is also trying to have its cake and eat it too a bit here, I think, because they recognize on certain matters of immigration, particularly how people feel about security and vetting, that they perhaps are lacking.
Yeah, we'll get to, I want to bring in some poll numbers in a second, but let's just maybe focus on this LDD case for a second here, Jordan. Do you think that, I mean, there's still so much we don't know, but there are serious allegations about someone and serious allegations about whether they should have been given citizenship given their past alleged associations with ISIS. Do you think it's appropriate in this case to revoke someone's citizenship? Like, is this a perfect candidate for someone who should no longer be a Canadian?
Well, I think politically, if you wanted to make the case, yes, this is exactly the type of case that you would be looking at that would have pretty broad support. But, and I think back to that debate, of course, in 2015, where Prime Minister Trudeau said a Canadian is a Canadian. And the reason that came up is because the Conservative government at the time had brought in legislation that really expanded the number of ways citizenship could be revoked. And that did spark a conversation, one that I think is actually really important, about whether that is useful or really a helpful way to approach citizenship. Because that's, of course, a punishment that's only available to people who become citizens, not to people who are born here. And so I think, personally, it makes me a bit uncomfortable, because I would say, we've seen certainly terrorism as a homegrown threat as well. We think about the Toronto van attack or the attack in London, Ontario, so regardless of somebody's citizenship status, the issue is the criminality of the terrorism and the threat to Canadians. And so I think, properly, it would be nice if the focus stayed there. But I certainly understand politically why Minister Miller was out speaking so strongly today. He doesn't want to leave any daylight on this issue for the Conservatives to come at them.
Yeah, Amanda, I remember actually speaking to some Liberals back in 2015 when this was an issue, and they were hearing it a lot at the doors in the GTA. Like, they were going to different doors in Brampton, Mississauga, all across the 905, and a lot of newcomers were worried about the prospect of their citizenship being stripped not necessarily for terrorism, but for whatever reason might have popped up, and that maybe criminality could be used against them, and that they could somehow lose their citizenship. This is a delicate political issue, isn't it? And it could be explosive, really.
It is. It's a delicate political issue, and it's made even more delicate by the sensitive environment that we're in right now. And whether that's, the conflicts that exist in the Middle East or, the rhetoric that's used, the anti-immigration rhetoric that's being used in virtually all corners of the globe, seeping in as closely as our neighbors to the south, right? So there's a lot of other issues. I mean, 2015 looks not a lot like 2024, right? Things have changed dramatically. And I think Jordan really hit the nail on the head when she talked about how this issue it's a political hot potato too. And you could see that with Minister Miller today. He had to use the language that he was using because he's being pressured from both the NDP and the Conservatives to really tackle this issue in a way that's going to be palpable for Canadians. And right now, when Canadians are I think we're going to be talking about this in a minute, are feeling less open to the idea of immigration, some of those topics end up bearing onto these decisions. And I think that we're really seeing that in the way that our politicians are using language, both around immigration or the revocation of citizenship, or, just how immigrants are being treated in the country.
Yeah, let's talk about that. I want to bring up some data from a Leger poll that was conducted before these arrests. It's obviously data that predates this discussion about LDD and terrorism and citizenship, but I think it's important that we just kind of bring this into the discussion because Leger, a respected polling firm, of course, found that 60% of those surveyed in this poll said that Canada accepts too many newcomers, and that's up 10 points from a similar survey in February. 28% said the number is just right, and only 3% said Canada should welcome more newcomers. Amanda, what are you thinking when you see those numbers? I mean, 60% of the country wants fewer people coming in. There used to be a consensus, right? A fairly, standard consensus in this country that it's okay to bring in more people. We should have more people coming in. Is that consensus starting to crumble?
I think it is. And I think that what was revealed out of that poll and what some of the analysts were looking at were the reasons why Canadians were feeling that way. And at one point, we saw those reasons really around economic issues and housing issues, and that's still true today. But some of the other things that we're starting to hear is things like not reflecting our Canadian values. I thought that was really interesting because I was actually on a call-in show and for CBC out of BC, and I had a couple of callers who called in who asked specifically about this idea of immigration and whether or not immigrants reflect Canadian values. And that's rhetoric that we're seeing in other parts of the world. So I mentioned it just a few minutes ago, we are so exposed to the American rhetoric, Trump talking about mass deportations, or if we look across to Europe, when we look at something like France's anti-immigration party, who picked up so many new seats in their snap election, we're seeing this kind of volatility of language around this topic, and it's certainly influencing how Canadians feel about immigration. And you couple that with issues like housing and economic concerns on the back end of the pandemic, and you have a bit of a perfect storm.
Yeah, and to add to your list, the riots in the United Kingdom as well, much of it motivated by anti-immigrant sentiment. Tim, what is your thoughts on, the crumbling consensus? Give me your thoughts on that, but also I want you to weigh in on Pierre Poilievre in particular, who is taking a bit of a harder line on immigration. I don't know if you've seen this tweet that was circulating over the weekend, but he's blasting the government for saying that they're allowing tens of thousands of, quote, low-wage foreign workers from poor countries to take the jobs of young people when youth unemployment is so high. So even you're seeing a little shift in the language that he's using to describe this issue.
I think that's reflective of what Amanda talked about a moment ago, that the sentiment's out there, and he's probably hearing that as he's touring. The challenge, though, and let me speak to it from an Eastern perspective. You've just been vacationing in the East. I'm from the East. We need workers of all variety, low-wage, high-income earners, professionals in Atlantic Canada, because of the demography. And I think it depends, the consensus on immigration, yes, is crumbling, but in certain parts of the country, it is stronger rather than weaker because of the economic realities that are present there. In my province of Newfoundland and Labrador, our premier and past premiers have recruited people from overseas immigrants, and not just Western European immigrants. They've looked in the Middle East and elsewhere for doctors and nurses, and that still continues. Part of the challenge, I think, for political leaders, regardless of stripe, is to continue to govern themselves as responsibly as they can, because we do have shrinking demography. We do need people. This has always been a country that has been underpopulated. Yes, right now, significant challenges around the way people feel because of affordability, but we can't get too caught up in the short-term political opportunity of rhetoric with the long-term policy challenges that we have.
But doesn't the government deserve some of the blame for this crumbling consensus? I mean,
of course they do.
They've let in over a million people.
Every party, look, the government in particular, everybody's played off of each other, right? And I think reasonable people are getting a little bit sick of it. It's really easy to say, oh, well, that person took so-and-so's job, but I can point to 1,000 service businesses in Atlantic Canada, if there are in fact 1,000, where local people, for different reasons, do not want to take some of the jobs that are there. And those service businesses exist because people who are from abroad in different places are prepared to work there. And as a consequence of that, local entrepreneurs are able to employ people, pay taxes in those areas. So we have to be a tad bit more sophisticated about the way we look at this.
I guess there's some dispute about whether you need to allow 1 million people over the last year.
The number issue is a legitimate question.
Yeah, I think that's maybe why we're seeing stress in the housing market. You know, people are struggling to find primary care and doctors, of course. But Jordan, Tim makes a good point. I mean, the International Monetary Fund just released its report on the state of the Canadian economy, and they found that we're probably going to achieve a soft landing, which is that inflation will come down, the economy will hold up, and that there will be modest growth, in large part because of immigration, because we are integrating so many new people. They need to buy things, they got to go to stores, you know, they got to go to chiropractors, or they got to go to the service businesses that Tim's talking about. Like, they spend money and they are contributors to the economy. Do you think, though, that there needs to be maybe a better balance in terms of how many people are here and what, you know, is it working as it is now?
Yeah, well, I mean, clearly no. Like, that's the problem, and I think it's notable that all parties are now saying that there's a systemic issue in our system, and it's also notable that all parties within the mainstream are still very pro-immigration. And so I think that, you know, the crumbling consensus that we're seeing in public opinion polling is worrying, but I don't think we're past the point of kind of hope on that yet. But it is a big problem when people feel that the system doesn't have integrity, when they feel like they can't count on it, when things like you know, people slipping through who have very concerning pasts, or when employers are abusing the temporary foreign worker program. This is what makes people feel really frustrated and has them lose confidence in the system. And I think that what you're going to see, and you saw it actually in the tweet from Pierre Poilievre today, is a very surgical move to go into the temporary immigration stream and look at, just in the same way student visas were a subject of scrutiny in the spring, now the temporary foreign worker program is going to become a greater subject of scrutiny, and as it should. Like, this is something that has been in our economic mix since the 70s, but like, it's grown by over a third in the last 4 years alone. So this has now become something that a lot of employers are really like leaning on and has become core, but that has to be balanced with some of the other realities there.
All right, smart discussion. Let's leave it there. Thank you so much to the Wednesday Power Panel, Amanda Alvaro, Tim Powers, and Jordan Likeness. Appreciate your thoughts